I hate to say it, but it's time, honey. It is time to switch over to manual. The only setting you're allowed to keep in auto mode is focus. In this video, we're going to learn all of the basics that you need to know in order to take this step. And as always, I'll make sure that it's super easy and super digestible and not overwhelming at all. Now let's start with frame rates. If you want to shoot a video, the first thing you need to do is determine where you are in the world, because there is something called an NTSC region or a PAL region. Now, if you're in North America, in parts of South America or Japan, for example, you should set your camera to NTSC. Now, if you're in Europe, Australia, or India, then you want to set it to PAL. If you are in an NTSC region and you want to shoot real-time video, which is basically this, you want to shoot in 24 frames per second. Whereas if you're in a PAL area like me, you want to shoot this at 25 frames per second. And if you want to shoot in slow motion in either of these regions, these are the frame rates that you can shoot in. And this is literally all you need to know, so we can move on to the next one, which is shutter speed. When you're making video, shutter speed and frame rate will go hand in hand. In photography, there are choices to be made, but in video, it's actually very straightforward because the shutter speed that you're going to set depends on the frame rate you're shooting in. All you gotta know and all you gotta do is just double the frame rate to get the right shutter speed. So if you're shooting in 25 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/50th. If you're shooting in 100 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/200th. And this is called the 180-degree rule. Now, if you shoot at a higher number, what's gonna happen is that it's going to look very robotic. And if you're shooting at a slower number, you'll get a lot of motion blur. And to get the most realistic look, which is what we're looking at right now, you want to double the frame rate. If you're using the 180-degree rule, it will always look perfect. So whatever frame rate you're shooting in, just double it. And shutter speed is actually part of the exposure triangle. I don't know if this is a triangle. There we go. You may have heard of the exposure triangle before. It consists of the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. Together, they regulate the amount of light in your video. And usually when you adjust one, you also need to adjust another. But in video, this is actually really easy and really straightforward. Like we discussed, we double the frame rate to get the right shutter speed, so therefore we cannot touch the shutter speed. So now there's only the aperture and the ISO left. Aperture is the opening of the lens, so let's assume that this is the opening of the lens. This is our lens, and this is a very wide aperture. Now, if I'm gonna close the aperture, you can see that less light comes in, and when I open it, more light comes in. The lower the number, the wider the aperture. Now, how wide your aperture can go depends on the lens that you're using, and you can find that number right here. Ideally, if you shoot in low light surroundings a lot, you want to go with a very low number because that means the aperture can be wide open and let a lot of light in. So therefore, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, or even a 2.8 will work great in this situation. Now, this is not all that the aperture does. It does not just define how much light can come into the camera. It also produces that nice blurry background that we all know and love. The lower the number, the more light comes in, but also the shallower the depth of field, the blurrier your video is. Now, I get it. This is pretty, and I know that you're tempted to shoot everything at 1.4 or 2.8 now, just wide open, get that blurry background, but I'm telling you, please, just shoot at f4, f5.6. You'll get a very crispy image and you still get the blurry background. I'll make a video about this, so subscribe if you want to see it, because this is something that I see people do a lot. The last exposure setting of the triangle is the ISO. ISO, very simply put, is just fake light that is produced by the camera itself. The shutter speed and the aperture, or actually mostly aperture in video, is controlled by the lighting in your surrounding, and then the ISO is actually produced within the camera. The rule of thumb is to keep this number as low as possible, because what this does is the higher you go up in ISO, the more grain it will produce, the more noise it will produce. So therefore your videos are just not gonna look that good. How high you can go with the ISO before it starts producing noise really depends on the camera. There's not one number that fits all cameras. There's nowadays a lot of cameras that can actually go up really high in ISO without producing any noise. So definitely check out what that would be for your camera. You can test that yourself. However, I would still recommend to keep it as low as possible to get the cleanest image possible. A situation where I would touch my ISO, obviously I know the ISO thresholds of my camera, but where I would touch my ISO is if I'm, for example, shooting at a concert and I'm already in a low light situation and I've got my aperture wide open and it's still too dark. I don't touch the shutter speed like we talked about before, but that is when I will crank up the ISO. But again, know your thresholds, know where you can go before you come home and you realize that all of your videos are are now trash. There is one more setting that I need you to switch to manual right now. Like grab your camera right now and do this right now. And that is white balance. Now, auto white balance is such a nightmare when you're filming video. I have actually keyframed the temperature and the tint to get it right throughout the video. And that took hours, and I highly recommend you to not be that stupid, okay? I've noticed that for some people, manual white balance is a little bit tricky because we're talking about Kelvin, we're talking about like different things, but we're gonna keep it super simple because all I need you to start doing is use the presets. Are you outside? Is it cloudy? Set it to cloudy. Are you outside and it's sunny? Set it to sunny. If you're shooting indoors, I would recommend to set a custom white balance, but usually with most cameras, it's so straightforward. You just put a piece of white paper in front of you, set the white balance that way, and you're good to go. Congratulations, you just became a professional. Unlike me. If you want to be even more professional, then go watch this video right here. And of course, make sure that you subscribe. Thank you. Bye.